Welcome to the workshop, Flash Fiction, Stunning Short Fiction. I'm Cindy Skaggs. I'm glad to have you here today as we work to a deeper understanding of flash fiction. Neil Gaiman in his masterclass says short stories are the last chapter of a novel you didn't have to write. The characters have a sense that they've been on a journey, things have happened, and they've finally reached their climax. So Gaiman's description really resonated with me because I'm a long form writer. I typically write 800 to 100,000 or 80 to 100,000 words in each manuscript, but I really struggled with shorter forms. I would jokingly tell people that every short story I started turned into a novella or worse, a full-length novel. And then I discovered flash fiction, and the constraints of flash fiction made staying short possible and necessary. And we're going to look at that when we get to the point where we're looking at how to write flash fiction. But first, let's define it so we're all in the same place. Flash pieces are not, however, excerpts from larger works. Flash fiction pieces typically don't cover thoughts and feelings. So instead of going into the thoughts and feelings, they're like mini movies that use character, scene, action, and dialogue to tell the story. So while the form typically leaves out a character's thoughts and feelings, that doesn't mean that you can leave out elements like character and action. In the same way, an economy car and an SUV are vastly different in size, but they both have four wheels, car doors, engines, and steering wheels. Flash fiction and longer form fiction still have to tell a story. So when you're writing flash fiction, there's some things to avoid that will keep you from making some general mistakes. Avoid ending with a trick. So don't end a story with a trick like, and then she woke up. So those surprise endings no longer have a surprise for the reader, and they really feel like you're cheating, and the reader doesn't appreciate that. Also, for the same reason, avoid ending with a joke. Avoid too many characters. You can use a group identity as a character. So in other words, we're going to read a piece by Shone, and in her piece, she said the two characters are kids and teachers. So she's lumping them into one big group. Again, avoid thoughts and emotions. Let the reader's emotions happen in reaction to the story and not based on a character's internal dialogue. You should also avoid stories without plots. And I think that's one thing that people don't always see the story arc in flash fiction. So we're going to look at how you can make yours stronger. And then avoid morality tales. The goal is not to tell people what to do or how to behave. Save that for your allegories. So instead, flash fiction pieces are short. They offer a complete plot or story arc, and they have a surprise or twist at the end. Magazines and journals and other publications don't follow the same guidelines. It's not like there's a department of flash fiction somewhere. I think it confuses the issue that there's so many different definitions or uses of flash fiction. So they might use different word counts or different definitions. Sometimes they don't even call it flash fiction. Sometimes it's called sudden fiction, short shorts, or microfiction. But in general, flash pieces are standalone stories that are 1,500 words or less, although some journals will limit that word count to between 250 and 750 words. And we're going to look at a couple examples today. There's a journal that publishes just 100-word stories, and I really recommend that you check them out just because they're easy to read, they're very easily digestible, and they give you a lot of places to look to see the story arc play out on the screen. There's also a magazine called Brevity. Now, Brevity publishes flash nonfiction, which we'll talk about here in a minute, and it has to be under 750 words. These stories are compressed, they're very detailed, they're focused, and there should be a form of tension in the story. Like all good fiction, flash fiction is designed to shed light on the human experience. The story should linger in the reader's mind. There should be a turn or surprise at the end. And all of the stories that we talk about today are those stories that really stuck with me for a while. Dinty Moore, who is the editor of Brevity magazine, he's also a professor of creative writing, compares flash pieces to smoke jumpers. Those brave firefighters who jump out of planes and land 30 yards from where the forest fire is burning. The writer starts the reader right at the edge of the fire. So don't just start in the middle of things. Start at the edge of the fire so the reader can feel the heat. All right, so we are going to talk briefly about micro memoir because I do have students who prefer to write nonfiction or creative nonfiction. The guidelines for flash fiction and what we're talking about today also apply to micro memoir. So if there's a prompt that we use, you can also use for creative nonfiction. Remember, though, that in creative nonfiction, you can't make anything up. True stories must remain true. And so an issue arises when it comes to something like dialogue, where our memory may be spotty, particularly if it's 10 or 15 years ago. If you use direct dialogue, in quotation marks, it should be exactly what was spoken. If you can't remember exactly what was said, you might use italics for dialogue. And that sort of just helps let the reader know what is 100% what was spoken and what was the gist of the conversation. All right, we're going to talk about reading like a writer. And the reason we do that is that classes like these really do educate you, but you can do a lot of the work yourself by starting to ask questions of the flash fiction that you read. So the first thing to writing flash fiction is to read flash fiction. To adequately understand and practice flash fiction, it's imperative to read like a writer. That really just means we tear things apart to see how they're made. So the next few examples are designed to get you to consider how the piece was created. You'll notice that you have some questions, either if we're on YouTube, there's some questions in the description, or if you're in an actual class, I have a book list, a sheet that has these questions on there. The idea is to read whatever your flash fiction piece that you want to emulate. Read the first time through for the story. But as a writer, you don't want to think that was a great story and then move on to the next story. There's very little learning and reflection when you do this. So read the story again and again to figure out the mechanics, the what and how of the writing craft. So the questions on the screen now, I'm going to copy into the chat so you have access to them, because we're going to talk about some flash fiction pieces and we're going to ask these questions of those pieces. The first one that I want to talk about is Neil Gaiman's 100-word story, Nicholas. This comes from his book, Smoke and Mirrors, and it demonstrates both the intense focus, the details and imagery, and the turn at the end. I think it's instructive to hear the author read his work. So listen to this, and then we're going to break out those questions that were on the last slide.
Nicholas was older than sin, and his beard could grow no whiter. He wanted to die. The dwarfish natives of the Arctic caverns did not speak his language, but conversed in their own twittering tongue, conducted incomprehensible rituals when they were not actually working in the factories. Once every year they forced him, sobbing and protesting, into endless night. During the journey, he would stand near every child in the world, leave one of the dwarves' invisible gifts by its bedside. The children slept, frozen into time. He envied Prometheus and Loki, Sisyphus and Judas. His punishment was harsher. Ho, ho, ho. It's a very, very short story. But I learned things from it. I learned about compression. I learned how to make the penny drop. Part of the fun of that story is where in the story do you figure that Nicholas was Santa Claus? Where do you learn that this is the punishment of Father Christmas? And so it's just a small thing. The glory of a short story, too, is just one thing has to happen. In novels, lots of things happen. A novel has to be about lots and lots of different things. A short story really only has to be about one thing. You can say that one thing. Then you can stop, get on to something else.
All right, so now we're going to pause for a minute and read this story and break it down with those questions from that slide, reading like a writer. A slightly longer example is Pamela Painter's The New Year. So in this, we're going to see stronger attention to the details and imagery of the scene. It's tightly focused, but still has that turn at the end. So we're going to read that piece together, and then we're going to break it down with those questions again. It's late Christmas Eve at Spinelli's when Dominic presents us, the waitstaff, with his dumb idea of a bonus. Italian hams in casings so tight they glimmer like Gilda's gold lame stocking. At home, Gilda's waiting for me with a surprise of her own. My stuff from the last 3 months is sitting on the stoop, arms crossed, scarlet nails tapping the white satin sleeves of her robe. She says she's heard about Fiona. I balance the ham on my hip and stuff my things, CDs, my weights, a vintage Polaroid, in the garbage bags she's provided free of charge. Then I let it all drop and offer up the ham in both hands, cradling it as if it might have been our child. She doesn't want any explanations. Or the ham. Fiona belongs to Dominic, and we are a short and sad story of one night's restaurant despair. But the story's out, and for sure I don't want Dominic coming after my ham. I pack up the car and head west. The ham glistens beside me in the passenger seat. Somewhere in Indiana, I even give it a seatbelt. I stop to call, but Gilda hangs up every time. So I send her pictures of my trip. The ham under the Silver Arch of St. Louis, the ham at the Grand Canyon, the ham in Las Vegas. I'm taking a picture of the ham in the Pacific when a big wave washes it out to sea. I send the picture anyway. The ham in the Pacific undertow. In this picture, you can't tell which of us is missing. So let's examine this closer and look at some of those questions for this. So in many ways, flash fiction packs a more powerful punch because of its concise nature. In creative writing, it's often said that the tighter the container, the more powerful the emotions the author can present to the reader. Because the flash form is compressed, writers are able to write about powerful, overwhelming subjects: betrayal, domestic abuse, lives imploding. In longer works, the reader might be overwhelmed with unrelenting heaviness. In flash, hot bursts of intensity work extremely well. So we're going to look at one more example and ask some questions of this example as well. This one is called Under the Shells, and this is an example. We're going to talk here in a minute about titles. This is a 100-word story, and that's a really great website to look at these very, very concise flash pieces. So we're going to read it again and then talk about it. After the bomb scare, the high school snapped transparent knapsacks to students' backs like inside-out turtle shells. Kids huddled in corridors, avoiding each other's eyes, embarrassed by their zit creams, off-brand tampons, unopened packs of condoms, their Ritalin and inhalers, spare underpants and holey socks, satin scraps of security blankets, love letters from exes and lunch bag notes from moms, wadded Kleenex, laxatives, chocolate wrappers, unsigned permission slips, and essays shot through with red ink. Teachers paced like drill sergeants monitoring the hallways, tense as minefields. Students held their breath and waited. Somehow, they all knew the explosion was coming. One of the great things about this piece in particular is the tension that's there, and really, it's broken down almost by sentence, beginning and middle and end. So let's look at those questions and see how they apply to this particular story. All right, so we're going to talk again about titles in flash fiction. It actually matters. Like poetry, they set the expectation. Titles can hint at the theme, such as they do in the last one we looked at, and I just want to go back now that we've looked at it. Under the Shells, so they're like turtle shells. They should be protected, right? And yet they're clear and transparent. And instead of protecting, they're exposing what's in the student's backpack. So that's one way it works. But it's also a larger metaphor of this under the shell, under the protection, supposedly, of these knapsacks. So the under the shell acts as sort of a unifying theme for the story. Titles also work as a first line on occasion. So in Neil Gaiman's Nicholas, he starts with Nicholas was as the title. And it's actually it's part of the first line of the flash piece. So that's another way that titles can work. Titles provide context as they do in Painter's piece. So we didn't really talk about the title of that one, but it's The New Year. So that's why it was the celebration for New Year that's got these celebratory hams that he's got going on. So that works in Painter's piece as providing context for us. And title also demonstrates a twist on occasion. When you look at Gaiman's piece, once you get to the end, you put together the title Nicholas was with the twist at the end, and you get that surprise of which Nicholas he's writing about, which is Saint Nick. All right, so we've gotten some basics here. Let's talk about how to write flash fiction or a micro-memoir. The key is to begin at the end. Remember Gaiman's admonition that short story is the last chapter of a novel you didn't have to write. Leave out the setup and the subplots. Head straight for the climax of the story and stick to that one moment. In Painter's story, the focus is on a server who is caught cheating. The rest of the story represents the repercussions of that action. Work with just one or two characters to help maintain focus. Gaiman's focus is on Nicholas alone. In Under the Shells, Schoen groups characters so that we have two groups, kids and teachers, that act as characters. Make sure you have a beginning, a middle, and an end. There is a sense of movement in flash fiction where each word pushes the narrative forward. Gaiman's piece demonstrates this with his paragraphing. Each paragraph represents the beginning, the middle, the end, and the twist. Create conflict. And I think that is often missed in some of our early examples of flash fiction. To have conflict, one or more of the characters must have a goal. In Painter's story, the narrator's goal is to save his relationship with Gilda. The conflict exists in the pile of his stuff on her steps. In Schoen's piece, the goal is survival, and the conflict is the antagonist who is implied but exists passively in that last line as they're waiting for the explosion. Make sure to create a turn at the end that leaves the reader on a different emotional tone than you started. Give the reader something to think about. Think about Gaiman's last line, his punishment was harsher, while the next, ho, 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 is the surprise turn that makes the torture punishment really sink in, especially when you reflect back on the title, Nicholas Was. Focus on details. Use really strong imagery so that each word you use counts. Remember what Gaiman said in that short video, compression matters, and that's what you're teaching yourself with these shorter pieces. Think of Painter's essay where imagery flows from the glimmer like Gilda's gold lame stocking to the last image of the ham floating into the Pacific. Create an evocative title. We've talked a little bit about titles, but since your word count is limited, let the title do the work. Give examples. Use the first line as title like poetry, or offer a hint such as Nicholas and St. Nicholas. The metaphor of Under the Shell. It isn't until you think about the clear knapsacks as their turtle shells that you really see the full story. I've also read flash pieces that use the title as the first line, and the story isn't clear if you skip the title. So that one's a lesson in reading the full thing. Editing. Editing is what matters most with flash fiction. Pamela Painter says, the difference between a good story and a publishable story is revision. One of her suggestions is to write the first draft and then cut it in half, then cut it in half again. So if you started with 1,000 words, you end with 250 words. I've done this with flash fiction contests to narrow the story to fit the guidelines. But what it's teaching you is how to eliminate wordiness, how to compress to the most finite details, make each word count, and remember the imagery and the details are what makes these stories so evocative. So that's what we mean when we say practice compressed narrative. With compression, editing is everything. You may not have a short enough form until you've gone after the prose with a red pen, and that's either literal or metaphorical. Think of the line from Aladdin, the Robin Williams as Genie version. Phenomenal cosmic powers, he says. Itty bitty living space. And so that's what you've got to do, is these giant stories in a very small living space. Write concisely. Hone your sentences until all wordiness is eliminated. Think along the lines of Gaiman's piece. In 100 words, he helps to define a new element of Father Christmas's experience, not as Jolly Santa, but the man imprisoned like Sisyphus. Read your work aloud. With flash fiction, the sound and cadence of the story is as important as the story arc. Read aloud to find the right word or phrase. It also helps to eliminate errors like missing words. And that's one of the things as a teacher and an editor I see very often, is that students leave out words because they're not reading it aloud. They're not taking time to read it slowly. All right, submitting flash fiction. I enjoy writing for the sake of writing, but there's value and joy in seeing your work published. Publishable flash fiction offers compression, language, character, and story. While the number of magazines and journals that accept flash fiction is high, I'm not going to list them all here because their submission guidelines change. journals go in and out of publication, but I'm going to show you where we can find some. And if we have enough time, I'll actually show you the website that you can create your account on. Brilliant Flash Fiction obviously accepts Flash Fiction for ongoing contests and anthologies. In addition, both brevity and 100-word stories, both of these I've mentioned earlier today, they accept Flash Fiction and Flash Nonfiction. Both use Submittable. So Submittable, if you haven't used it before, it's a good place to start. You can search for specific types of journals, types of creative writing, and by contests. You can even look at which submissions have free submissions as opposed to pay submissions. This means you can quickly discover, which is one of their terms, who is publishing Flash Fiction at any given moment. One thing you can do when you're seeing these different journals listed in Submittable is go look at their journal. There's a place where you can view the website. Go look at them and see what their Flash Fiction looks like. It's a great place for you to start looking at what is successful in Flash Fiction, but it's also a way for you to create your own prompts. And we're going to go over that here in a minute. So if you're interested in hearing about future classes that I do, please, there's a short subscription form link in that book resource that I gave to you guys. You can unsubscribe at any time. The only thing I use it for is to let people know when I'm teaching classes. All right. So this looks simplistic. It says write 100 to 250 word Flash piece that models Gaiman's. Here's what we're going to do. The key is that you need to learn to create your own prompts. Using one of the sample essays, create your own prompt. And so if you're looking at 100-word stories and you really like a story, start breaking it down so that you can model it. And we're going to use Gaiman's piece to do that. So you're going to use an existing piece and pick it apart. There's 4 paragraphs that represent the beginning, the middle, and the end, and the twist in Gaiman's piece. So you're going to try and do the same thing with the same number of sentences. We're going to put a lot of constraints. The challenge with these Flash Fiction pieces is the more constraints that you have actually leads to better pieces, partly because we're so busy worrying about, I've got to have this many words and this many sentences or this many syllables, that you're not thinking about writing. You're just meeting those guidelines. And so it kind of tricks your brain into writing. If you need that. I sometimes need that. And this is a good place for me to say, one of the reasons I started writing Flash Fiction, when I came out of my MFA program, I was just creatively depleted. I'd gone through 2 years the MFA. It was a 3-year MFA and I did it in 2 years. I'd published 6 books in that time period, written and published, and my brain was just done and I was exhausted. And Flash Fiction became that place to sort of recover the play and the joy of writing. And I've since decided that Flash is one of my favorite things to do. So if we're using Neil Gaiman's piece, try to do the following. In the first paragraph, you're going to write 2 sentences that introduce the character. In the second paragraph, he adds conflicts. So notice his second paragraph is 1 sentence. Can you do that? So have a whole paragraph that's a really long sentence that adds your conflict in there. In the third paragraph, he increases the tension to the point where Nicholas is sobbing. So in your third paragraph, increase the tension with no more than 3 sentences. And then in the fourth and final, we're going to keep it short. That's where you're going to add the twist. So this is the ending and the twist. So in 3 sentences, you need to bring your story to conclusion with the final twist like Gaiman's ho, ho, ho. Once you finish, read it aloud. Where is there unnecessary wordiness? Listen to how it sounds. Where can you change the words to make the imagery more evocative? Where can you add more details? Now, revise it until it's between 100 and 250 words. You'll notice that in your resource that I've given you guys, there is 2 prompts in there, and then hopefully you can look at what I did with Gaiman's story to help you start to create your own prompts based on stories that you enjoy that will challenge your creativity and force you to do the compression necessary for Flash Fiction. We're going to open it up for questions. Let me know in the chat.